second day on the consultation on the public health and emergency guidance. We will be having a series of presentations quite similar to yesterday's structured sessions. We will have a couple of presentations from Rachel, who will be taking us through our preparedness and response to public health emergencies. And then we will be hearing from Janique as well on public health and emergency management with respect to human mobility and protection of vulnerable groups. After that, we will be having a deep dive into our regional priorities, taking a closer look at the Africa region and trying to understand what's going on right now, what is the Africa CDC and what is the IFRC and Red Cross movement in general prioritizing with respect to public health emergency management within the region. What are the challenges the Red Cross movement or Africa CDC is facing, or member states within the Africa region are facing, and what are we prioritizing for the next steps going forward. We also hope to hear from you as well as participants in this room. As vibrant as you are yesterday, we do expect that you will be as vibrant this session, to hear from you about what you think should be the priorities of Africa when it comes to public health emergency management. And what do you think in terms of legislative processes that there are opportunities to engage with within the continent. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I would just like to remind you to please keep your mics muted unless you are speaking. If you do have any questions that you would like to raise, please feel free to raise your hands. And then once the presenter is done making their presentation, they will be able to address them. Please feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions, share any comments or ideas that you may have, and also to introduce yourself if this is the first time you're coming in, or just to reintroduce yourself to let us know that you're in the room. We would appreciate hearing that from you as well. I'd just like also to let you know that we do have interpretation services available. So if you see the bottom of your screen, there is a little globe, and you can be able to select between the English, French, and Arabic channels of choice, so that you're able to engage in these discussions in your language of preference. With that being said, I would like us to get into the first presentation, and I want to hand over to my colleague Rachel to take us through session 4 on preparing and responding to a public health emergency, after which we will be able to join into our breakout rooms to have more in-depth discussions on this very exciting topic. Thank you very much, and over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you very much, Stella, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to join you again. During this session, we're going to be looking at preparedness for public health emergencies, and we're actually going to be looking at 3 topics. So firstly, we'll be looking, as I mentioned, at preparedness. Then second, we're going to look at states of exception. And then third, we're going to look at legal facilities for humanitarian actors. And these topics correspond to questions 4, 5, and 6 in the guidance. Okay, so let's start with preparedness. So as you know, a really important feature of an effective framework for managing disasters, it's the preparation and the planning that we undertake in advance. Some of the most important preparedness activities include contingency planning and education, training, and drills, both for the general population and for the key actors that are going to be involved in response. And preparedness also includes the development of an early warning system that prompts early action. So one positive finding from our study is that laws and policies generally do make provision for PHE preparedness. If we could just go to the next slide, please. This is usually found in general disaster management frameworks rather than in public health emergency specific instruments. Can we please just go to, thank you. Although we found that most states' laws and policies do make provision for preparedness, we found that there was nonetheless scope for many states to improve their preparedness arrangements by having clearer and more detailed requirements and enforceable duties for contingency planning. Now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown that it's important not just to plan for the key response actions, but also to plan for the continuity of government and the continuity of essential services. So we recommend that contingency planning should also focus on the continuity of the legislature, the continuity of general healthcare, so healthcare that is for health needs other than those relating to the health threat, schooling, and also sexual and gender-based violence protection and prevention services. Interestingly, under the international health regulations, states have a duty to notify the WHO of all events that may constitute a public health emergency of international concern. But they don't have an obligation to provide notification or warning to key actors or the general population within their own state. The research that we conducted found quite limited evidence of there being duties on public authorities to warn key actors and the general population of health threats or biological hazards. And this is quite a serious omission, given the importance of early warning and early action in preventing the spread of a novel infectious disease. Of course, in order for early warnings to actually translate into early action, there needs to be awareness at all levels of society and in all communities. And without that awareness, early warnings are unlikely to be very effective. And therefore, it's also important to have appropriate education, training, drills and simulation exercises to enable key actors and the general population to be ready to respond promptly and appropriately to warnings. So in light of the key findings on preparedness in our PHE report, we make a number of recommendations. We recommend that laws should allocate roles and responsibilities and even enforce duties for PHE preparedness, and that has contingency planning, early warning, education, training, drills and simulation exercises. We also recommend that laws should require contingency planning to take place, not just for the main response actions when there is a public health emergency, but also to address the continuity of government and of essential services. We recommend that laws should require regular PHE education, training, drills and simulation exercises. And they should require the public authorities to provide early warning, both to the key actors that are going to be involved in the response, but also to the general population. Okay, so we'll now move on to the second of the three topics that we're covering today, which is states of exception. Now, this topic is addressed in question 5 of the PHE guidance. And question 5 asks, do your country's laws establish states of exception for responding to a public health emergency that are tailored and proportionate to different degrees and types of risks? So let's just take a step back for a minute and discuss what a state of exception is. So as we use it in IFRC disaster law, state of exception is an umbrella term to refer to a state of disaster, a state of emergency, or a state of public health emergency. In general, when a state of exception is declared, it triggers the availability of emergency powers. It can also trigger the release of resources. So for example, if there is a disaster fund, the resources in that fund may become available once a declaration has been made. A declaration can also be the trigger for special emergency coordination and leadership mechanisms. So in general, states of emergency are designed for very extreme and unforeseeable situations, and they may be provided in a country's constitution. And in contrast, states of disaster or states of public health emergency are usually found in disaster management or PHE legislation, and they usually give rise to more limited and specific emergency powers and arrangements. However, I would like to note that this is really just a generalization, and that the use of these various different terms varies quite a lot depending on the country. So in IFRC disaster law, we've done a lot of research on states of exception, and we actually have already addressed this topic in a lot of detail in a previous guidance document that we prepared, which is called the Disaster Preparedness and Response Checklist. And in that checklist, we recommend having a variety of different states of exception that are proportionate and tailored to different types and magnitude of disaster. So, for example, a localized outbreak of an infectious disease could be dealt with by declaring a state of public health emergency or state of disaster for the relevant province or region, with an escalation to a national state of public health emergency, or even a state of emergency if the outbreak spreads throughout the country and becomes very severe. The PHE report finds that states of exception were used very, very widely to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, in all of the 32 states that we surveyed for the PHE mappings, some form of state of exception was used. So we can see that states of exception are a common tool for dealing with a serious public health emergency. Of course, as you all know, the use of emergency powers and measures can have human rights impacts. So, for example, lockdowns and other restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic have had impacts on the rights to freedom of movement and assembly, as well as many other human rights. And another point to note is that when a state of exception becomes very protracted, lasting many months or even years, it can undermine the rule of law, it can undermine democratic institutions and government accountability. There can also be a lack of clarity about how a state of exception works, which can create uncertainty and delay. Some of the matters that need to be really clear are who is responsible for making the declaration, when they can make the declaration, and what type of emergency powers and arrangements become activated when they make the declaration. So in the PHE report, we have a number of recommendations about states of exception. As I've mentioned before, we recommend having a variety of different states of exception that are proportionate and tailored to different types and magnitude of disaster, so that the system can be scalable depending on the nature of the disaster. We recommend clearly identifying the person who has the authority to make the declaration, and also establishing a hierarchy of officials authorized to make the declaration if the named official is unavailable. We recommend that the law needs to very clearly identify the trigger for making a declaration, and this should preferably enable a declaration to be made preemptively if a public health emergency is imminent and would have a severe impact, rather than having to wait until those impacts are actually felt. The law also really needs to identify requirements for consultation. And we recommend that the person who is making the declaration should be required to consult with or act on advice of a specified individual or agency. So, for example, in the case of a public health emergency, there could be a requirement that the person making the declaration needs to first consult with the health department or the health minister before making that declaration. In relation to emergency powers, it's very important for the law to clearly specify which emergency powers arise once a declaration has been made. Any limitations on human rights should be necessary, temporary, proportionate, and prescribed by law in order to mitigate or minimize human rights impacts during a state of exception. And finally, there should be oversight by courts and parliament of what the executive branch of government does during a state of exception. And there should also be a hard time limit for a state of exception, after which it can no longer be further extended. So these recommendations are addressed in under question 5 of the PHE guidance. We'll now move on to the third and final topic to be addressed in this session, which is legal facilities. So this topic is addressed in question 6 of the PHE guidance, which asks, do your country's laws provide legal facilities to eligible humanitarian actors for public health emergency preparedness and response? So the term legal facilities is another umbrella term. It refers to special legal rights and exemptions that enable an actor to conduct their operations more efficiently and effectively. So as you know, humanitarian actors can play a key role in the response to all different types of disasters and emergencies. But to do so efficiently and effectively, they do require legal facilities. So, for example, in the context of a natural disaster, they may require priority processing of their goods and equipment so that it can enter the country quickly and reach the affected people. We have already done a lot of research on legal facilities at IFRC disaster law, and we have already prepared 2 guidance documents which address this topic. And that is the Disaster Preparedness and Response Checklist and the IDRL guidelines. And it's worth noting that we recommend that governments establish a process for determining which actors are eligible to receive legal facilities. And the idea behind this is that legal facilities shouldn't just be provided to anyone, but they should really only be provided to the core group of actors which a government can trust to provide quality humanitarian assistance and to adhere to principles such as impartiality and independence. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really demonstrated that many of the legal facilities that we've already been looking at are also relevant to public health emergencies. They're not just relevant to natural disasters. So, for example, some legal facilities that can be useful in the public health emergency context include the automatic or expedited recognition of professional qualifications, for example, for doctors or nurses who may be travelling from one province to another within the country or from outside of the country in order to provide assistance. Expedited visas and work permits for professionals assisting with the response, and exemption from taxes and duties to ensure that humanitarian organisations are able to channel as much of their resources as possible into providing assistance to the affected population. The COVID pandemic has really also illustrated that the types of restrictions that may be introduced to prevent the spread of an infectious disease can impede the response activities of humanitarian actors. So the restrictions that may have this effect include lockdowns, shelter-in-place orders, curfews, restrictions on business operating hours, and even restrictions on exporting medical equipment or supplies such as personal protective equipment. So humanitarian actors need to have appropriate exemptions to these types of restrictions to ensure that they can continue to carry out their work during public health emergencies. But unfortunately, our research revealed that this type of exemption is relatively uncommon, or at least it was relatively uncommon in the context of the COVID pandemic. I do have one very positive example to share with you though, and that's from the Philippines, where a strict home quarantine was introduced in March 2020. All households were required to stay at home except to access basic necessities. However, the health workers and volunteers of the Philippine Red Cross were clearly designated as health and emergency frontline workers during the quarantine. And this preserved their ability to travel freely throughout the province and to continue conducting their activities, supporting the government in its response to the pandemic. So in the PHE report, we make a number of recommendations about legal facilities for humanitarian actors. Firstly, we reiterate our existing recommendations about legal facilities generally, and those recommendations come from the Disaster Preparedness and Response Checklist and the IDRL guidelines. In addition, we recommend that humanitarian actors be provided with exemptions from restrictions that are introduced to curb the spread of an infectious disease, including any restrictions on internal movement, restrictions on business operations, border and travel restrictions, and restrictions on the import and export of goods and equipment. Now, of course, governments may wish these types of exemptions to be subject to health safeguards to ensure that the epidemiological situation is not aggravated. So, for example, if a humanitarian actor is to be exempted from restrictions on internal movements, this could potentially be subject to a requirement that all of their staff and volunteers are regularly tested and use adequate personal protective equipment. But of course, any health safeguards that are introduced as a condition of legal facilities should be proportionate and tailored to the health risk and not be framed to effectively render the exemptions unusable or unworkable. So that brings me to the end of this presentation on preparedness and response. And we've covered three key topics. Firstly, the key preparedness activities that need to be undertaken. Second, state of exceptions. And third, legal facilities for humanitarian actors. And I think that we're now going to transition once again into the breakout rooms to hear your experience and your views on these really important topics.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for that very in-depth presentation on preparedness with respect to public health emergencies. So as Rachel just shared right now, we have a few questions, just similar to yesterday's session. We're going to have a few breakout rooms. We'll have 4 breakout rooms, an Arabic-speaking breakout room, 1 French-speaking breakout room, and 2 English-speaking breakout rooms. I'm just going to open the breakout rooms right now. I'm going to request my colleague Janique to just post the Google Doc that we are going to be working on in the chat box right now. And when I open the breakout rooms, I'll be able to assign you into the groups. But if a pop-up comes up and lets you know in the next 2 minutes, the breakout rooms will be for 30 minutes. So now it's 29 past 2 p.m. So at 3 p.m. we'll be able to close the breakout rooms and come back to plenary. And I really do hope your discussions are as vibrant and as exciting as they were yesterday. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your discussions when we come back. So just 1 second, I'm opening the breakout rooms right now. I think that should be okay. And now you've been invited to join, so please proceed to the breakout rooms as they appear before you. Thank you. I will ask Elvis to please facilitate the breakout room in French. Thank you.
Allô?
Oui, je pense que nous avons été ramenés dans le groupe général.
Okay.
Coming in back. I think everybody's coming back into the main room. Just to remind you that we do have translation in the main room, so please select the globe at the bottom of your screen and join the language that you would like to listen to these discussions in. If we're all back, because I think we're all back right now, I'd just like to hand over to my colleague Reese, who will be taking us through the plenary. Thank you so much. Over to you, Reese.
Thank you so much, Stella. And thank you so much for my particular group as well in the breakout rooms. I think we had a very, very good engagement. So if I can just start off without being too biased with English group 2, that was breakout room 3. If we can just go over what we discussed with regards to the questions on preparedness, the state of emergency, as well as the legal facilities as well. I think, Asma, you're going to be representing our group.
Yes. Thank you, Reese. Thank you. Should I go ahead?
Please feel free.
Okay. In regards to question 1, our topic discussion demonstrated a multiple of interventions. So let me start with the first one. We discussed that governments should demonstrate their commitments to protect communities from disaster and PHEs. This comes from prevention as well as response. Key is to ensure that countries map out the hazard and threat areas that may occur and keep stock of such, and these should inform policies and laws to prepare for such occurrences. Also, input from communities and experts need to be considered, and a multi-sectoral approach needs to be taken to ensure sufficient planning and preparation. Vulnerability assessments also need to be undertaken to ensure that vulnerable groups are identified and mitigation steps are identified in the planning process. This also should include migrant and refugee communities, as for the vaccine rollout time lapsed for the inclusion of migrants and refugees was lengthy, and it was unnecessary in means of the current needed immediate response to the public health emergency. Laws and policies should support the inclusion of these groups in response activities for the future. Again, vaccine rollout, the vaccine rollout in means of there was a humanitarian buffer provided in some countries, and it can be advocated for this to be rolled out globally to facilitate community access to healthcare, testing, and vaccines. This is for question number 1. For question number 2, we talked about the importance to work with the community when declaring a state of emergency. The community being on the same page as the government is important for any response. Experience from community engagement has shown that many people understand key information about the disease. Once the information was shared, the community response was stronger. Field surveys, for example, on COVID vaccine indicated hesitancy. So awareness is key to ensure communities understand the importance of the vaccination to ensure unity and equity of the vaccine rollout. For question number 3, 2 elements were discussed. A, access to data. Holding data can hinder the public health emergency actors to respond accordingly. B, humanitarian and public health access. There needs to be a corridor to allow movement of such actors, but there needs to be a balance between allowing actors and protecting the actors and the population from the health risks. There also needs to be security provided for such actors to ensure they are safe in situations of unrest. The actors need to be provided with security, allowing them to do their jobs without facing safety threats. For question number 4, the ICRC supports the finding of the PHE report in regards to this topic. I think this is the end of the discussion that was provided for the group I participated in. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Asma. Yes, we see that relevant engagements, and we also note that when it comes to the aspects of preparedness, one of the things that you mentioned and the group discussed was the whole of society approach, taking into account as well vulnerable groups. And then with regards to facilities, you mentioned aspects on having access to data as well as just humanitarian access within the field. Those are very important points. Now, if I can move over to the first English group, I think Rachel or Maria, that was your group. Is there a spokesperson that was presented in that group that will present on their discussions?
Yes, that's Martha. So
thank you very much, everyone. Our group, I think, focused mostly on question number 1, and a lot of debate came up as we discussed. But let me go through that briefly. What was discussed? One of the proposals was really for us to implement the WHO guidance on preparedness for public health emergencies. That is how member states can best prepare for public health emergencies. Then also the group discussed the need for a package that allows for quick response to public health emergencies, that is planning preparation to expedite response. Then also we should also consider what is discussed in the joint external evaluation, that is on the core capacities, particularly coordination with security agencies, should also be considered when preparing and assessing preparations for public health emergencies. And then there was also much discussion on the early warning, and it was agreed and discussed that early warning is usually for the national authorities to respond by assessing the potential or magnitude of the public health issue. This should be, however, done very cautiously so as not to cause panic and not within a legal framework or regulations. And then also we discussed that the early warnings should be clear and actionable on the steps that should be taken so that everyone in the public is aware of what should be done. Then in our group, we also discussed and agreed that the laws that we have in the different member states are very archaic. They lack provisions on early warnings and the alert systems. And indeed, some states have resorted to using SOPs because coming up with new laws or amending the archaic laws to come up with provisions on early warnings or alert methods is lengthy. And the process to come up with new laws is very laborious and time consuming. However, some discussants also said that maybe we should have international laws in place that make it easy for member states to adopt and domesticate the international laws. Although some members also said that this may not be possible because different member states have different constitutions. Some member states may require that a particular international law is easily adopted as long as the country has signed it. But however, some member states may require that in the constitution that a particular international should be first ratified, that is, it should go through the cabinet or parliament. So we can't have a one size fits all. So we can't have international laws being automatically domesticated into national laws. However, we still think that it should be easier and easily to customize international laws to guide public health emergencies. And we had a debate, quite a lengthy debate on whether we should focus on using SOPs guidelines as for public health, for preparedness for public health emergencies, since the laws are coming up with new laws is very laborious and lengthy. However, we agreed, I think, I may be biased because I'm a lawyer, but however, we agreed that even if coming up with new laws is lengthy and time consuming, they have a legally binding status on the whole nation as opposed to SOPs and guidelines, which may be unique to a particular health sector in government. And one of our colleagues gave us a very good example that even if laws are legally binding and cover the whole nation, a whole country or nation, it is important that we have laws being publicized and sensitized on published for everyone to know about the existence. So we had an example of Sierra Leone. The laws on COVID-19 were not popularized, yet the local authorities had their own bylaws. So the position is that it is better if local authorities like the chiefs in villages can be brought on board when we're passing such public health emergency laws so that they're easily introduced to the rest of the member states or countries. Thank you. So we're only able to cover question number 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Martha. Thank you for presenting on your group's discussions. I really find it interesting what you mentioned with regards to early warning systems, and particularly not to when it's pushed out to not cause panic and to actually educate the community. That's obviously very important when it comes to preparedness. And then also with regards to universal laws, being adapted, and this might be particularly specific to the African region as well, to being adapted to specific scenarios to meet the needs that it should. If I can move over to the first group, being the French group. Elvis, I think you were in this group, you facilitated. Is there somebody that is or planned to represent the group?
Yes, I think Madame Christy Chiwoda is going to present for the group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elvis.
Okay. Bonjour à tous, merci de me donner la parole. Donc, je vais vous faire un résumé de ce qui a été fait dans le groupe en français. Donc, à la première question sur la contribution des lois à tous les niveaux à la préparation, nous avons pensé qu'il faut d'abord que des lois qui ciblent de façon explicite la préparation existent. Il faut que ces lois existent. Il faut qu'elles incluent le mécanisme de préparation, qu'elles incluent des mécanismes de préparation et que ce soit des lois qui concernent la préparation. Quand on parle de préparation, qu'on ne voit pas seulement la préparation au niveau central dans les systèmes, qu'on puisse intégrer tous les niveaux intermédiaires, périphériques, etc. Concernant la deuxième question, sur Allô? Ah, OK, c'est la traduction. Concernant donc la deuxième question sur les problèmes associés à la déclaration de l'état d'urgence, nous avons mentionné les retards dans la déclaration, nous avons mentionné également les implications politiques, les implications économiques et même sociales des déclarations d'état d'urgence avec les réactions des populations. Nous avons également mentionné comme enjeu la communication suffisante avec les populations pour qu'elles adhèrent aux restrictions qui sont souvent contenues dans les déclarations d'état d'urgence, mais aussi le fait que les lois et les prescriptions relatives aux états d'exception et d'urgence sont souvent faiblement diffusées ou bien mal connues par les populations ou bien par les différents acteurs. Nous pensons que des exercices de simulation qui associent les populations, mais aussi les acteurs pourraient aider à mieux connaître ces lois de telle sorte que quand il y a la déclaration d'un état d'urgence ou bien d'un état d'exception, que ça ne soit pas une surprise. Nous avons également noté la faible ou bien la mauvaise adhésion aux restrictions et puis finalement le fait que parfois les critères qui doivent présider à la déclaration d'un état d'exception ne sont pas clairement définis quand les lois existent. Concernant la troisième question sur les exemples qui peuvent empêcher la réponse aux urgences de santé publique, nous avons énuméré le fait que, par exemple, dans la plupart des pays, le principe de l'exercice des professions médicales et paramédicales doit être fait par les nationaux. Donc, le principe, c'est l'exercice par les nationaux. Or, on sait qu'en situation d'urgence, il peut être nécessaire que des praticiens étrangers viennent intervenir dans des pays qui ne sont pas les leurs pour pouvoir exercer. Donc, pour pouvoir résoudre ce problème-là, nous avons proposé que les lois prévoient des autorisations d'exercice d'urgence qui ne seront pas délivrées dans les mêmes conditions que lorsqu'on demande une autorisation d'exercice en situation de routine. Nous avons également proposé l'harmonisation des standards de soins parce que on peut facilement se retrouver dans une situation de, comment on dit ça, je ne vais pas dire conflit, mais en tout cas de discordance entre les standards de soins dans le pays hôte et le standard de soins parmi les praticiens qui sont accueillis. Donc, il est important qu'il y ait cette harmonisation-là pour pouvoir faciliter l'exercice. La dernière question, nous ne l'avons pas traitée, nous n'avons pas pu la traiter en groupe. concerner les commentaires sur les questions qui ont été identifiées dans le guide. À titre personnel, je voudrais juste suggérer d'utiliser le thème préparation et réponse ou riposte plutôt que intervention. Je voudrais également proposer que au niveau du point, je pense que c'est le point 4.7 du guide, qu'on parle de risques sanitaires, pas de risques biologiques et risques ou sanitaires, parce qu'il me semble que les risques biologiques sont des risques sanitaires. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Christy, for providing feedback in the French group. Thank you very much for that. We noted that when it came to preparedness, you spoke about that preparedness equals integration, which is also what we touched on with the laws in yesterday's discussion as well, is how important integrating a whole PHE framework actually is important. And then with regards to state of emergency as well, sufficient communication, 100% important. We do take note of those comments as well. And with facilities, I think as Rachel as well mentioned, the importance of having the foreign licensing guides as well, accepting foreign qualifications as well, to not hamper the speedy humanitarian assistance that comes into the country as well. Thank you so much for the feedback as a whole, the different groups, the different facilitators, for discussing and encouraging the engagement in the groups. I am now going to hand over to Janique. Janique is going to be presenting on session 5. She's going to be discussing human mobility and migration, as well as the protection of vulnerable groups. I see Stella is first on. Thank you, Stella.
Thanks so much, Janique. I thought before we go into, sorry, thanks so much, Risa. I think before we go into Janique's presentation, I'm seeing a few faces in the room that are new, and I just wanted us to kind of turn on our cameras and say hi to each other before we go into the next presentation, so that we can see each other. And say a quick hello in today's session. So welcome everybody to today's session. I'm seeing a few new faces. Great. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you all for joining us again today. I hope you're enjoying the discussions that we're having today, and really thank you so much for your active participation in this particular session. So as we get into the next session, where Janique is going to be taking us through the second half of the major presentations we will be having today, I do invite you to keep talking, smile with each other, keep saying hi to each other, and keep engaging in the chat. Thanks so much, and over to you, Janique.
Thank you so much, Stella. Let me just quickly share my screen. And it was nice to see all the participants. Thank you very much for turning on your cameras. There we go. Let me just quickly presentation mode and turn my camera on. Sorry, my Zoom is a little bit laggy today, but I will get there. Great, thank you so much. So as Stella mentioned, I will be presenting this session on human mobility and vulnerable groups in public health emergencies. So we're first going to have a look at human mobility and migration, which is addressed by question 7 of the PHE guidance. And then second, we're going to look at the protection and inclusion of vulnerable groups in PHE preparedness and response, which is addressed by question 8 in the PHE pilot guidance. So question 7 really asks, do your country's laws and policies contain measures to address the specific issues relating to human mobility and migration that may arise during a PHE? Question 7, as the rest of the questions included in the pilot guidance, is supported by a series of guiding sub-questions which target specific issues that need to be considered with regards to this topic. And it is really based on the findings of the PHE report on this topic. So let's look at these findings and recommendations in a bit more detail. So all types of disasters can have an impact on human mobility. Similar to other types of a disaster, a PHE may prompt in some instances physical flight, a fear of contagion, or a desire to avoid restrictions, which could drive both internal and international movements. But the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that public health emergencies can affect human mobility in quite different ways than other types of disaster. Restrictions imposed to prevent the spread of the disease can actually create quite the opposite of forced displacement, namely forced immobility. Border closures and travel restrictions introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic had a negative impact on many of the migrants and foreigners wishing to return home, some of whom became stranded. In most cases, citizens or permanent residents of a country were exempted from inbound border restrictions and permitted entry. But in some cases, restrictions on outbound travel and practical impediments such as a lack of access to commercial flights and other restrictions ultimately impeded repatriation. So to give a few examples of this, Australia introduced an arrivals cap, which essentially limited the number of passengers permitted to enter the country per day. This arrivals cap made it very difficult for Australians living or traveling overseas to return home, with tens of thousands of Australians becoming stranded overseas. Another example is that Russia closed its borders to outbound travel. And one of the country mappings in the PhD report, the Tajikistan mapping, recorded that as a result, many Tajik migrant laborers in Russia were unable to return to Tajikistan. Border closures and travel restrictions potentially impinge on the right under Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to be free to leave any country, including one's own, and not to be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter one's own country. Border restrictions may also be inconsistent with the temporary recommendations issued under the international health regulations. This occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic in February 2020, when the WHO issued temporary recommendations which advised against the application of travel and trade restrictions. The negative consequences of forced immobility can be especially serious for migrants who have lost their livelihoods, have irregular or uncertain migration status, or are experiencing illness or disease without access to healthcare. With few exceptions, financial or welfare benefits provided during the COVID-19 pandemic were only available to citizens or permanent residents. With respect to access to healthcare, the PHE research indicates that many states adopted a wide range of approaches, from providing full access to healthcare through to excluding migrants or only providing partial or conditional access to migrants. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some states did provide assistance to migrants and stranded foreign citizens by, for example, permitting them to access healthcare or financial assistance programs and extending their visas. So to share two positive examples with you, in New Zealand, a foreign national health support program was established, which could be accessed by foreign nationals who were unable to return home due to the COVID-19 restrictions. And foreign nationals experiencing financial hardship and who couldn't get home due to these restrictions were provided with access to an emergency benefit, which was a weekly payment to help with basic living costs. As another example, in the UAE, periods of leave were extended and exemptions were issued for visa violations arising as a result of the pandemic. So tourist, visitor, or resident visas which had expired due to the travel restrictions were granted an automatic extension. So although these are two positive examples of assistance to migrants that were provided during the pandemic, these types of examples were by no means universal. Border closures and travel restrictions may also have very severe and even in some instances life-threatening consequences for refugees, asylum seekers, and others fleeing irreparable harm. Moreover, if border restrictions result in the return of refugees and asylum seekers to the countries where they risk persecution or irreparable harm, this actually breaches international refugee law and international human rights law. Specifically, under the Refugee Convention and major international and regional human rights instruments, there is a legal obligation of non-refoulement which means that states must not return a person to a country where they risk persecution or irreparable harm. Even during a public health emergency, asylum seekers should be admitted and have their claim for asylum assessed. Unfortunately, at least at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, a significant number of states that partially or fully closed their borders did not make exceptions for asylum seekers. In some countries, there were also delays in the processing of applications of asylum seekers due to the disruption caused by the pandemic. It's important, therefore, for the processing of applications to continue even during a public health emergency, because delays can mean that asylum seekers are not eligible for essential services, financial support, employment, or family reunification. Let's now have a look at the recommendations of the report relating to human mobility and migration. As we've seen from the COVID-19 pandemic, border closures and travel restrictions may play a role in preventing the international spread of a novel infectious disease. As border closures and travel restrictions are likely to be used in response to future PHEs as well, this is something that should be planned for and addressed in laws and policies. So the PHE report recommends that laws should clearly specify the criteria for border closures or border restrictions and how such closures or restrictions will be practically implemented. The criteria should at all times be consistent with states' international legal obligations under international human rights law, international refugee law, as well as the international health regulations. In addition, there should be exceptions on humanitarian grounds for refugees, asylum seekers, and others fleeing irreparable harm, as well as for migrants and foreigners that wish to be repatriated. Lastly, laws and policies should establish contingency arrangements to ensure that the reception of asylum seekers and the processing of asylum claims continue during a public health emergency, with priority to those who are most vulnerable. So, as I mentioned previously, these issues are addressed in question 7 of the PHE pilot guidance and its guiding sub-questions. And the question itself is really an overarching question of whether or not the country's laws and policies contain measures to address the specific issues relating to human mobility and PHEs. And the guiding sub-questions address the specific issues and recommendations that I've just gone through with respect to this topic. Let's now look at the findings and recommendations relating to protection and inclusion of vulnerable groups. So the protection of vulnerable groups is addressed in question 8 of the pilot PHE guidance. And this question really asks, do your country's laws and policies contain measures to ensure that vulnerable groups are included in and protected by the arrangements for preparing and responding to public health emergencies? Similar to the previous questions, question 8 is supported by a series of 20 guiding sub-questions which target the specific issues need to be considered. And these guiding sub-questions flow from the findings and recommendations of the PHE report. So let's go through these findings and recommendations in a little bit more detail. So in general, disasters have a propensity to disproportionately impact certain groups within society. These can include women and girls, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, persons with illness, migrants, indigenous groups, racial and ethnic minorities, and sexual and gender minorities. We refer to these groups with the umbrella term of vulnerable groups, although we are aware of the fact that this term does have some shortcomings. But these groups are potentially just as vulnerable during a public health emergency as in any other type of disaster. As the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated, transmission of and serious illness from a new disease may be much higher among vulnerable groups due to, among other factors, increased exposure and decreased access to public health facilities. The COVID-19 pandemic has also illustrated that in a PHE, there may also be different types of impacts on vulnerable groups, and there may also be additional categories of vulnerability. So we're going to go through these additional categories and impacts in a bit more detail. So firstly, we're looking at people who are susceptible to the relevant disease or health risk. So these are people who are most immediately vulnerable during any PHE because they're inherently more susceptible to the disease itself. This can vary from one PHE to another. So for example, during the 1918 pandemic, influenza pandemic, young people were most at risk, whereas during the Zika virus outbreak, pregnant women and unborn children were most at risk. As we now know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, older people and persons with certain underlying health conditions are more vulnerable to the disease. Therefore, laws, policies, and plans can't assume that any particular group will necessarily be more susceptible to the relevant disease or health risk. Another category of persons who are disproportionately affected or may be disproportionately affected in a PHE are people at economic and financial risk. This is because PHEs can have devastating impacts on the economy and on businesses and workers, especially those who are already experiencing economic marginalization. This has been illustrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it equally applies in more localized PHEs. For example, the World Bank estimated that the 2014 to 2015 Ebola outbreak nearly halved the number of Liberians in employment. PHEs can therefore necessitate large-scale economic support programs. And a flow-on consequence of the economic impacts of a PHE can also be on the household's ability to continue to make rental or mortgage payments, which leaves them at risk of losing their housing and warranting temporary legal protections against eviction or foreclosure. Another category of persons studied in the report include people experiencing homelessness. So during a PHE, people experiencing homelessness may be at particular risk of contracting the relevant disease or illness due to the fact of living in either very crowded conditions where the disease is spread more easily, or due to a lack of access to sanitation, healthcare, and information. So the protection of people experiencing homelessness during a public health emergency can and should be addressed through contingency planning. In addition, incidents of domestic violence, including intimate partner violence and violence against children, have a propensity to increase during disasters of all kinds, but including public health emergencies. So restrictions on freedom of movement, such as lockdowns or shelter-in-place orders, can magnify this risk by preventing people from leaving their homes to seek safety or to access support services. Equally, an increased demand on these services can result in the support services becoming overwhelmed. So contingency planning is really key to ensure the continuity of these services during a PHE, as well as ensuring that exemptions are in place to movement restrictions to enable people at risk or who are currently experiencing violence to leave their homes and seek safety. Then with relation to school children, we know that schooling can really be disrupted during any type of disaster, but the main difference in a PHE is that the disruption can be much more widespread and of a much longer duration. So lengthy physical school closures can increase child protection risks and have a significant adverse impact on children's education, social development, and physical and mental health. So the report recommends that school closures should really be a last resort during PHEs, and contingency planning should address the continuity of schooling during a PHE. Then finally, migrants and marginalized groups, marginalized racial and ethnic groups, are at risk during a PHE of being disproportionately impacted due to pre-existing health inequalities, as well as language and cultural barriers to accessing healthcare and information. So appropriate and adapted healthcare measures are really needed to protect these groups during PHEs. In addition, as we've touched on previously, irregular migrants or certain categories of visa holders may be ineligible for government assistance, and therefore full access to healthcare should be provided regardless of immigration status. So looking at the recommendations of the report, the PHE report has really identified that a wide range of legal and policy measures were introduced to protect and assist these groups during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as historically during previous PHEs. However, these positive measures were by no means universal, and they tended to be more prevalent in states with more resources. Also, in general, the measures typically had to be introduced by rapidly making new laws and policies. But because these types of impacts are foreseeable and likely to arise again during future PHEs, they should really be addressed in advance of a PHE through laws, policies, and contingency plans. So laws should really prohibit direct and indirect discrimination in a disaster and PHE risk management activities. They should facilitate the participation and representation of vulnerable groups in disaster and PHE risk management activities. And they need to be flexible and not assume that any specific group will necessarily be susceptible to the relevant disease or health risk. In addition, laws should require contingency planning to address the provision of healthcare, information, sanitation, and other support to vulnerable groups during a PHE. They should require contingency planning to address the continuity of schooling and domestic protection services. And they should establish temporary legal protections against eviction or foreclosures in the event of a PHE that has significant economic impacts. Finally, laws should provide for migrants, including irregular migrants, to have full access to healthcare regardless of their immigration status during a PHE. And finally, they should provide exemptions during lockdowns for those that need to leave or remain away from home in order to escape violence or to access protection services. So thank you so much for your time and for your attention. We are now going to break once again into our breakout rooms to examine the questions on the screen. I'm once again going to quickly share the shared Google Doc in the chat so that we can look at them in a little bit more detail, these questions relating to the protection of vulnerable groups as well as human mobility and migration during PHEs. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janique, for that interesting presentation. I noticed that we have a couple of comments in the chat from Osman and as well from Dr. Kilinda. And I'm just wondering if, before we break out into the rooms, if we can just take a moment, Dr. Kilinda, maybe you could just unmute yourself and share your comments, and then we can hear also as well from Osman. Dr. Kilinda, over to you.
Thank you, Stella. During our group session, I think the time limit was an issue. Otherwise, what we were trying to discuss is, yes, member states have supreme laws, that is the Constitution, that provide probably some of them that international treaties once ratified, then those treaties ought to go through some enactment process through Parliament. Some, of course, have supreme laws that say all international treaties form part of the Constitution. But having said that, the issue here is we have seen situations where we have public health emergencies. The member states do not have sufficient laws. Even if they have laws in place, probably the provision to make a regulation is locked. In other words, does not allow to make laws to that extent to embrace that particular public health emergency. Sometimes we have provision for making regulations which says the minister shall make regulations from time to time on the following areas. That is now locked because it's specific on those areas. Of course, yes, it would be important to have a provision that says probably the minister shall make regulations from time to time on all matters incidental to public health and for connected purpose. That one is open, is good. And that's why when during the time of COVID-19, many member states could be able to come up with statutory instruments, which form part, of course, of the subsidiary legislation. But if at all in the main act you don't have that provision, you cannot come up with a statutory instrument from nowhere. It has to be anchored on a particular provision in the substantive law. my bone of advancement is that when international instruments are being developed, probably it would be appropriate to have an overriding provision that member states are obligated to customize that particular instrument with specific guidelines, maybe with exemptions on a particular issue like public health emergency. And therefore, if member states, if member states will probably be taking time because ordinarily it takes time, 2 years sometimes to come up with a law. And then the provisions of the international instruments will apply so that there is no void. We are talking of public health emergencies. And should member states, of course, have laws that they can make regulations to embrace the emergency, so be it. But if the member states do not have sufficient laws or do not have provisions in their main in the main acts of the whatever called archaic laws, then it will be important to say yes, they can now the international provision on that particular issue, for example, public health emergencies, applies, so that at no time there will be void in the event we have issues of public health emergencies that are of certain magnitude. That was my advancement. I did not mean that always the submersion instrument should apply blanketly. No, it only apply on specific situations. That's what I meant. So over to you, Stella.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kilinda, for that input. I think, yeah, I do hear your point about how we shouldn't have, international law applying blanketly. But we definitely do need to have a contextualization of national laws, and that's significantly important. I can see Dr. Martin, your hand is up, but before we get to you, let's just hear quickly from Osman, and then we can get to you. Thank you so much, Osman. Over to you, and then Dr. Martin.
Yeah, good afternoon, Stella. I was just mentioning that I saw the example which our previous presenter made of Liberia being suffered economic crisis during the 2014-2015. I just made mention of Sierra Leone as well, suffered the same. So I just want us all to know that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osman. Over to you, Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Stella, and thank you, colleagues that made the comments. I'm not a lawyer, but I practiced public health within the confines of the public health law. And just looking at the COVID-19 situation, where countries or state parties have laws, I saw a situation where almost everybody broke one law or the other. So law, whether international, they were broken. So what is the role of law in public health emergencies, and especially the early days of COVID-19, where not even our scientists knew about this virus? Nobody really knew, and the border restrictions and countries not exporting or selling products to other countries, et cetera, they all broke the laws. So I'm just wondering the need for laws versus the need for really applying the public health measures that our public health practitioners know are protective of our health, especially within the unknown context. It's a comment. I don't know. Thank you, Stella. Back to you.
Thank you so much for that comment. I think anybody who is working in the legal space during this public health emergency period of COVID-19 has one time or another experienced or being asked this question about what the role of the law is really. And I think there are a lot of nuances that would need to be touched on in terms of, political will to really follow the mandates or the measures that have been set out when it comes to public health measures. I do think that this is a very important discussion, and I really want us to put a pin in it, because I think we're going to get into ahead of ourselves, because this is something that we're going to be discussing into our next session. So I do see your hands up, Dr. Justin Manda, Dr. Kilinda. So I would ask you to please just put a pin in the comments for now, so that we could get into the breakout rooms, and then we would be able to come back when we're speaking about this regional priorities discussion and next steps. We can discuss about this very exciting question that Dr. Martin has just shared with us. So I'm just going to set us up into the breakout rooms at this point. And Janique has shared in the chat box the Google document that you can be able to fill in. It's divided into the different groups, and you will be able to give your inputs into that. So we'll be back here in the next 30 minutes. It's now 3:45. According to my time, we'll be back in about 30 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I think everybody is back in the room now, if I'm not mistaken. Let's have a quick look. Okay, I think everybody is back in the room. I hope you had a good discussion during your breakout rooms, just understanding what your experiences are with regards to protection of vulnerable groups. And I just want to open up the floor right now to any group that'd like to go first, maybe the French speaking group, Elvis and Christy and team. If you'd like to go first and share your feedback and points that you were able to discuss during the breakout room, the floor is yours.
Hello, merci de nous donner la parole. Donc, je vais restituer le travail du groupe en français. Donc, s'agissant de la question, la première question sur les impacts du COVID-19 et des autres urgences santé publique sur la mobilité, je pourrais dire qu'en termes de défis et d'impact, il y a eu que des restrictions de déplacement et de mouvement ont été prises en violation des dispositions du règlement sanitaire international. Il y avait le problème nous avons identifié le problème de la discordance ou bien de la non-harmonisation des mesures sanitaires exigées aux frontières dans les différents pays. Et puis, ces restrictions ont été mises en œuvre dans la plupart du temps de façon brutale, sans délai, sans donner le temps aux personnes qui étaient soumises de prendre un certain nombre de dispositions. Comment est-ce que nous pensons que ces problèmes pouvaient être résolus? Nous pensons que c'est très important la communication sur les restrictions, que ce soit au niveau interne ou bien au niveau international. Nous pensons évidemment qu'il faudrait respecter les dispositions du règlement sanitaire. Nous avons également pensé que ça aurait été important qu'il y ait une harmonisation des mesures sanitaires exigées aux frontières. Parce que, comme l'ont relevé plusieurs collègues, les tests valides dans les pays ne l'étaient pas forcément de façon automatique dans les autres pays. Nous avons également pensé que le partage des informations épidémiologiques entre les pays aurait pu faciliter la mise en œuvre de ces restrictions-là, de même que le fait d'avoir un mécanisme d'accès universel aux soins et services de santé qui inclut les migrants, les personnes déplacées dans les différents pays, et évidemment de prévoir un délai raisonnable avant la mise en œuvre des restrictions lorsqu'elles s'avéraient nécessaires. Pour ce qui concerne la deuxième question sur les personnes, les groupes vulnérables, sur les mesures d'atténuation de cette vulnérabilité, nous avons pensé qu'on pourrait ajouter à ce qui a été proposé les travailleurs de santé, les hommes, mais également les personnes vivant avec un handicap. Et les solutions pour pouvoir améliorer, pour pouvoir réduire les risques qui sont liés à la vulnérabilité, c'était le renforcement des mesures de sécurité, de santé au travail, notamment pour les travailleurs de santé, avec les normes de prévention et de contrôle de l'infection. C'était également la mise en place dans les cadres juridiques des programmes et des normes pour la prévention et le contrôle de l'infection au niveau de la législation, bien de la réglementation nationale. Nous pensons également que pour adresser la vulnérabilité de façon générale, il est important qu'on intègre de façon explicite une approche fondée sur les droits humains dans la préparation et la riposte aux urgences santé publique. Ça a été rappelé, ça a été beaucoup rappelé pendant la gestion actuelle de la COVID, mais on peut voir encore dans beaucoup de pays que juste l'exigence en matière de désagrégation des données pour prendre en compte les populations vulnérables n'est pas encore une réalité. Et enfin, s'agissant de la troisième question, nous avons estimé que la façon dont le guide, les questions ont été formulées pour la question 8 dans le guide pilote couvrent l'ensemble des champs qui sont qui sont importants, mais nous avons suggéré que les travailleurs de santé puissent figurer parmi les populations vulnérables parce que leur sécurité et leur santé ont un impact important sur l'efficacité de la préparation et de la réponse aux urgences santé publique. Il a également été suggéré un encadrement de la communication sur les risques ainsi que l'engagement communautaire, autant pour moi, pendant les urgences santé publique pour gérer ce qu'on a appelé l'infodémie pendant cette pandémie. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Christy, for that breakdown of the discussions that you did have in your group. It's really interesting to note what you were discussing about, having an inclusion of other stakeholders, really going back to the discussion we had yesterday about having an all society approach. And really interesting to note that we need to think about considering healthcare workers as a vulnerable group, because without them, and especially one thing we did see during COVID-19 is that in instances where there was already a limited supply or availability of healthcare workers in the country, when we had various waves sweeping through the country of COVID-19 and healthcare workers being affected, it really did have a very great impact in the ability of the provision of healthcare services within the country. So that's really an interesting concept of understanding the sensitive nature within which healthcare workers fall into and the vulnerability that they possess without us really weighing too much on that. I'd just like now to call over to the second group, which would be the English group 1. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. This is a discussion from group 1. For question 1, we had a scenario and a discussion on what happened with the Zimbabwe and South Africa. The scenario was that when the ground crossings, the points of entry were closed, when the borders were closed, there was a special repatriation program, and it was based on the acts of parliament of both the countries. And this was easily done based on those laws. However, this was also abused as some people who are moving back and forth from Zimbabwe to South Africa were using it as a way to move goods illegally. But however, the repatriation efforts proceeded smoothly, although some of these rules on the border closure were not implemented well due to corruption. Then also we had a scenario from Sierra Leone, and the issue to do with illegal migration. Some young people were migrating for work and they're using the route through Senegal. Back in August 2020, however, they got stuck when the borders were closed and they were relying on human traffickers. And when they got stuck in Senegal, but they were rescued, they were brought back by IOM, since IOM has an agreement with the government of Sierra Leone. However, some were actually tested positive for COVID-19, but they were able to be supported by IOM when they came back to Sierra Leone. Then on the second part of the question, what policies and laws could be used to mitigate the problems or negative impacts in that area? And there's need for laws to provide support and resources for migrants who get stuck due to border closures. One of our discussants said that in the developed countries, this is already in place, but in Africa, this is lacking. So it should be considered for in Africa. Then we also move to question number 2. So which were the vulnerable groups? And we have an example again also from Zimbabwe and South Africa. The poor were the most affected with the closure of the ground crossings, the borders. The rich were able to fly in and out of the country, but the poor were stranded because they're the ones who could actually use the ground crossings as a means of movement. So it was really a case of the rich making laws for the poor who are most affected. Then we had an example of Uganda, where the sick, the vulnerable, those who had like cancer could not travel probably to Nairobi or to India for treatment due to the closure of the borders. And then also within the country, due to the human immobility, there were problems whereby pregnant women could not access treatment very fast. HIV treatment has also had to be accessed, HIV treatment, and also cases whereby people were stranded due to lack of movement. So in Uganda, the only movement was for cargo during the closure of the borders in the first wave. However, in the second wave this year, we had learned our lessons and we put some exemptions in place whereby somebody could actually travel even if the borders were closed. So on the second part of question number 2, which laws or measures, which laws or policies are necessary to mitigate the impact? And the group discussed that we need laws that are societal driven, really involving the society, where people are fully consulted and are involved, so that implementation is better. Then also one of us discussed that there's need for continuous domestication of international laws on migration to check challenges to do with human traffickers. That's all we're able to discuss. We didn't proceed to question 3. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martha, for that breakdown of your group's discussions. Really interesting about the migrant workers who get stuck in transit. And we know that this, migration for work is really a phenomenon that's going on in Africa, I mean, and across the globe as well. But we do have a lot of young people who are moving from their countries of origin, moving to a different country, whether within the continent or outside the continent, in search of better opportunities for livelihood, to improve their economic status at home. And because we are living in a globalized world, I mean, this is, the norm of the world that we live in today, people not working in their countries of origin, but rather working in different countries. And then having this migrant workers, particularly the ones who would probably be blue-collar migrant workers getting stuck in transit, not being able to support their way back home or being able to accommodate themselves in these countries of transit, which can be quite challenging, and putting themselves in really difficult situations and exposing themselves to elements of exploitation, through human trafficking. And this can often have quite a detrimental effect. I think we did see some of the difficult such situations that some migrant workers within the Sahel region found themselves within Libya, and being exploited in that situation by human traffickers. So this is really something that is still going on, and understanding that this pandemic and having these border restrictions did have or exacerbate this kind of impact and exposure to exploitation. So really thank you for sharing that with us. I'll hand over now to the last group. I think that would be English group 2, to share your comments with us. The floor is yours. Over to you, Asma.
Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of similarities with the group that just represented right now. So let me go ahead and just start with the first question. For the first question, we gave an example from Egypt, since it also serves as a transit country for many migrants. When COVID-19 hit, there were massive delays in the processing for visas, asylum seekers, etc., and also delays and inequities in these groups for to be able to access the vaccines. There was no legal means or policy to include them in the vaccination efforts. Today they are, but early on in time they were not. Also, small, medium-sized income groups were impacted the most, as well as those who needed to cross the border for economic activities. The IHRS were violated, which resulted in these groups being impacted. For example, 40 of the IHR on charges relating to public health emergency measures. Most states required individuals to assume the responsibility of testing to cross the borders and did not assume the charges themselves. The costs in many cases could not be covered by individuals. For question number 2, we talked about the major groups that were affected, the vulnerable groups, including the migrants and refugees, as many of them are blue collar, and they lost their income and faced eviction from their homes. They also faced sexual gender-based violence and general physical violence. Reports increased drastically, and forced eviction. They faced shelter, welfare, and mental health impacts. These impacts were felt not only by the vulnerable groups, including migrants, but also their host communities. It is the responsibility of a state to ensure the lives and livelihoods of its citizens is maintained, while higher income groups could adjust and work from home, many people in lower income brackets who live day to day were not adequately protected. In a pandemic, laws and policies need to be in place to ensure all people have access to food and shelter necessary for their survival. For question number 3, the questions are comprehensive, but one aspect that is missing is the support for low-income workers who need to cross borders and who may not be able to afford the COVID-19 testing to enable them to do so. So specific support should be afforded to these groups in particular. This is all what we covered for the breakout session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asma, for sharing the inputs from your group. I mean, it's really interesting to know, just adding on to the last point that you just mentioned. Yeah, exactly. The costing for, you know, the vaccine, the testing rather for COVID-19 for particularly poor migrant workers was really quite a challenge. And even for those travelers who were frequent travelers before the pandemic, really have had a challenge as well, because of having to have this, you know, numerous COVID tests, especially sometimes if you're transiting through numerous countries, and the time frame within which they expect the results from the PCR to have been obtained can also be quite a challenge. And having to have more than one test within one particular trip is really quite a costly experience. So having that consideration about, you know, the economically challenged individuals within our communities and how we're able to support them. And just thinking about, as well as the migrant workers, as we start to move on to the next section, I'm just reflecting on some of the roles that, you know, the national societies within countries have been able to play in supporting migrant workers, in supporting vulnerable communities within their countries during this COVID-19 pandemic, and also other public health emergencies within their countries. And I think Asma, as from Egypt, Red Crescent, you could be able to understand some of these kind of challenges that the communities that you serve and the volunteers that you're in from your national society are engaging with, have been able to experience in their support for the affected populations, or the ones that have been, their vulnerabilities have been increased by this particular situation. So before we move on to the next session, I just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing your insights on this. And before we move into the next discussion, thinking about the regional priorities, I just wanted to let you all know, at this point, we've come to the end in terms of the consultation on this particular guidance. Thank you for your inputs that we've been able to get from the breakout rooms for the past 2 days. And there is an online survey for those of you who feel that you still want to contribute more, to give more feedback to this particular guidance. There is an online survey that is available. I think, Rachel, you could let us know how long it's going to be open for. Is it for the rest of the month?
Yeah, that's right. It'll be open until the 31st of October.
Okay, great. So it'll be open for until the 31st of October. I'll be able to post it in the link, the chat box below, and we'll be able to share it as well with you via your email addresses. I do believe we do have your email addresses from the invitation to this link, and you could be able to give your comments as well to this particular survey. So before we jump into the next session, I wanted us to do a quick Menti, just to hear your thoughts, and just as we stimulate our discussions on some of the topics or some of the discussion points that were brought up before we went to the breakout rooms, and so that we can understand, what do you think about where we are in terms of COVID-19 management, and what do you think about the roles of different organizations within COVID-19 management, and just generally within public health emergency management within the country, within the region rather. So we have this Menti that you can see on your screen right now. If you go to menti.com and put in the passcode that's written there at the top of your screen. I'm unable to see it because of I'm sharing my screen. If you just go into menti.com, you should be able to see it there. And just let me know, what do you think? What do you think about the role of the national societies in the COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think it's been well recognized in your country? Because we did have a lot of national societies, a lot of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies supporting national governments in contact tracing, supporting national governments in ambulance services, some of them even management of hospitals, small clinics within communities, being able to provide access to vaccines as well, really supporting populations, vulnerable groups in terms of gender-based violence cases being reported were on the rise, and being able to provide them with that kind of psychosocial support. But do you feel that their role within the COVID-19 pandemic, or even other public health emergencies pandemic, do you see as if this particular role of theirs has been provided or has been articulated quite clearly? Or is it something that we are finding that the national societies have this expectation to carry out specific activities? So this Red Cross or Red Crescent societies, you know, the Kenya Red Cross, Egyptian Red Crescent, Zimbabwe Red Cross, South Africa Red Cross, what work they were doing during the pandemic, offering this support services to public authorities in public health management and just generally to the government. How did you find their role being recognized within your country or just generally within the region, for those of you who've been able to engage with them? And what are your opinions on this? I can see Dr. Muita, your hand is up. Would you like to share something on this?
Yeah, I want to say some of us, and I believe some colleagues on online, we have not been working in our countries for the last 15, 20 years. So there's no option for, I don't know, something like that. It's a general comment. Because when you say some of us, when you say your country.
Okay, well, not necessarily, if not in your country, for example, in the country that you're working in, I'm sure there is a national society within that country, and you've seen how they've been able to work. I think you did mention that you're working in Addis, and we have the Ethiopia Red Cross. I think we even had a colleague from there as well. What has been your general impression about how this role of these national societies have been? Do you see that they have been able to, you know, be recognized, or do you think that this role has not really come clearly? Because if, like, just reflecting on what you just mentioned, perhaps you're unaware, being unaware of their activities might be a sign that maybe their role has not been very well recognized.
No, I know the national societies. I've worked with them in other countries and other partners as well. So I will respond accordingly. Thank you so much, Stella.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muita. I'm just going to give this a couple of minutes, and I just want us to move on to the next question just to hear from you. Got a few good inputs on this. So just moving on to the next question, you can see most of you agree that the role of the National Society has been well recognized. I mean, that's quite encouraging to see, but we do have a few of you disagreeing, and we will get into that a bit in the next session. Just reflecting on international law, and one of the points that Dr. Muita did raise before we went into this discussion about what the importance of law is in terms of management of public health emergencies. And we have this element of, you know, equitable access to vaccines. And this is something that we've had a real challenge with. And we know Dr. John has been very vocal about this particular issue with respect to Africa. And I just want to hear your thoughts. What do you think when it comes to international law and the discussions we were having yesterday with regards to the international health regulations and, you know, the different directives that are given by WHO? Do you think that international law has a role to play in ensuring that we have equitable access to vaccines? Or do you not think that international law can really make an impact in making sure that there's this equitable access? Because that is the challenge that we're presently facing as we're trying to get out or get above this cloud of COVID-19. It's the challenge that we're finding ourselves. And I can see that a lot of you do agree that there is space for this. So do you think there needs to be some more work? Do we need to have an international treaty on vaccine development and you know, sharing that proprietary information with regards to vaccines? Do we need to have a regional guidance within Africa or a regional treaty within Africa, similar to the one we have, you know, with the Kampala Convention? Do we need to have a similar convention for Africa for equitable access to vaccines or equitable access to specific elements of public healthcare management? These are some of the things that we're going to get into the discussion as we're getting into the next one. So thank you so much for your inputs and your contributions to this particular section. I really just wanted to spur this to help us discuss as we think about what do we want to prioritize for Africa moving forward? What do we want to show that this is what we think we need to be focusing on right now within the region? And for this particular section, as we discuss regional priorities, I want us to hear the different activities and the engagements that IFRC and also the Africa CDC have been engaging in. So I want to invite my colleague, Dr. Ben, to share some insights about what the IFRC and also the Red Cross movement in general within the region are working on and have been prioritizing and are prioritizing as next steps in terms of public health management within the region. So Dr. Ben, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stella, and good afternoon to colleagues. I've been listening very carefully and attentively, and it's very enriching discussion. So congratulations to the team for this excellent and brilliant conversation so far. So from my side, I will just try to give an overview of what we have been doing as Red Cross movement in Africa region, and also to highlight a few of the challenges that we have seen as it relates to this conversation we're having, and also what we see as a perspective moving forward in the future. So first and foremost, maybe just to, as a background, provide an information that for us at IFRC, our public health approach is anchored on the support we provide to national societies to build their capacities to deliver, first and foremost, community-led and people-centered interventions. And of course, this relates to various contexts, which of course many people have mentioned during various conversations, either be it migrants, people in other vulnerable settings or fragile settings, both in emergency and non-emergency situations. And this is clearly in line with the mandate of the national societies, the national Red Cross societies, as auxiliaries to their national governments in humanitarian matters. So the role of the national societies with respect to public health intervention is anchored on a legislation that is enacted in each country where the national societies operate. And national societies across Africa over the years have supported their national governments in responding to various epidemic outbreaks, be it meningitis, yellow fever, cholera, and others, and of course EBD, which of course is the most recent that we have all experienced. And very recently again, the COVID-19 pandemic and the issue of vaccine coverage. So our national societies are very well positioned with respect to their role, their mandate, and of course the support they get from the Secretariat to execute their mandate. Then, based on this, I just want to talk more on the preparedness aspect of our work, because for us at IFRC, after many years of supporting national societies in various responses, as I have enumerated, we saw a possibility of really repositioning the national societies to fulfill their mandate through a mechanism or way or an approach of ensuring communities are actually put at the center of both the preparedness and the response, because we have heard several times epidemics start and end in communities. So how do we ensure that these communities are well positioned and well prepared for such an eventual response. So back in 2018, we, with the support by the IFRC, with the support of USAID, started what we call the Community Pandemic Preparedness Program or project or initiative in 6 countries or 7 countries in Africa, but now reduced to 6. So which are Kenya, Guinea, Uganda, DRC, Sierra Leone, and Cameroon. So the essence of this, or the aim of this, was to strengthen the ability of communities, national societies, and other partners to prevent, detect, and respond to disease stress and prepare for future risks. So the program basically was focused on the ability of communities and people to act fast, the engagement of communities and adaptation to local needs and realities, and maintaining unfettered access to most vulnerable groups, which, of course, during the course of most of the conversation I've had mentioned, migrants and other groups. So this is one of the principal focuses of the program that I'm describing. Then secondly is empowerment and engagement of communities so that they are at the forefront of preparation for and responding to public health emergencies. Thirdly is about strengthening community systems. Systems meaning structures, supplies or equipment that are needed to prepare and respond to future epidemics. Then lastly is about institutional capacity of the national society itself, the communities themselves, the government structures at the community level, and all that are within the humanitarian architecture and space at community level. So this approach entailed engagement with a broad array of stakeholders who basically function at community level, either from government to private sector and other actors, anchored on the principle of the whole society and multi-hazard approach. I've heard the whole society has been a recurrent phrase in most of the conversation I've had today. So this project was basically anchored on such a principle and of course multi-hazard approach as well. And also traditionally wheelers, health centers, medical centers, private sector, media, schools, religious leaders and organizations, traditional and elected leaders linking to One Health establishments as well, Ministry of Health, DRR platforms, government, data sharing agencies or structures at national and local level, and our Red Cross headquarter branches and all areas of services, and of course not forgetting the community themselves, and also harnessing the knowledge sharing from other Red Cross movement partners who have implemented or are implementing similar approach in other countries. So it's basically ensuring that we harness the capabilities of every person that is engaged and present at community level to deliver on this program. And from the 3.5 years of implementation to community engagement, involvement of all key actors to develop community action plans, contingency plans, establish community-based surveillance systems for early detection and response. We have seen very clear and good results with our volunteers being involved in early detections of diseases like polio, measles, viral hemorrhagic fevers, anthrax, Rift Valley fever in Kenya here, COVID-19, meningitis, cholera. So key successes from this project really show that empowering communities could really help in terms of effective preparedness and capability and ability to respond early or to detect and respond early. So with that being said, a few challenges which we have heard from our colleagues, and of course, which some of us already know, those of us who have been acting in this space for some time. Chief among them, and first I would like to mention, is the recurrent hesitancy and delay with the declaration of certain outbreaks, for example, cholera in some places because of political reasons. This really hampers the capacity or the capability of these people who have been empowered to respond as and when needed. Secondly, I would like to mention is the absence of any law in some countries. This was given to me by a particular country, I won't mention the name, around epidemic preparedness, because our national society there at the beginning of the initiation of this project observed that there were no frameworks that were already established that would enable the national society to really embark on this initiative. So the national society, or the Red Cross National Society there in that country, has been advocating for the enactment of such laws. So I think that this is critical with respect to delivery of effective epidemic and pandemic preparedness. Then another critical mention to me about challenges was the lack of tax exemption for equipment that were supposed to be imported and pre-positioned for preparedness purposes in this country. And lastly, of course, which is the crux of the matter, because like this program or project I'm describing is only in select communities that have been identified as hotspot for certain outbreaks, but the needs are wider in many of these countries where we are implementing this initiative. However, local actors who are well positioned to be able to support national efforts in preparedness do not have access to public funds for preparedness efforts. So these are four key challenges that we have observed. So lastly, I would like to talk about priorities moving forward, and I'll group them into three areas. First is on program and service delivery. Second is partnership and collaboration. And lastly, on humanitarian diplomacy and advocacy. First, as it concerns our program delivery and service, we have got an excellent result with the implementation of the community pandemic and epidemic and pandemic preparedness project in the 6 countries so far. And we are looking at scaling up this preparedness across other countries to other countries in 2022 and entrenching the One Health approach, which has proven to really be key to the delivery of early detection and response, especially as it concerns zoonotic diseases in many countries that we have experienced these, and also ensuring and facilitating multi-sectoral participation and collaboration. Next is on the partnership. We're presently in conversation with institutions like Africa CDC and WHO and other stakeholders on how we could work together to build sustainable community-based regional capacities for health security in Africa. So with some of the stakeholders we're engaged in, these are already at advanced stages, like developing concept note to see how we go further to deliver full proposal of this, to do a massive scale of support to countries across Africa. And the last, as I mentioned, is on humanitarian diplomacy, which I saw from the Mentimeter, the first question, Stella, you put, very divergent views, which I think requires deeper unpacking, and I'll be happy to engage in that conversation. Is about promoting deeper and more sustained humanitarian diplomacy around the participation of Red Cross national societies in first, the formulation of relevant public health emergency policies and legislative frameworks that will guarantee delivery of services and safety of the most vulnerable population. So in a nutshell, these are just my contributions to the conversation that set the tone for that conversation and engagement. Thank you so much, Stella and colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben, for sharing those insights about what the Red Cross movement is focusing on within the region. And just like you mentioned, one of the central themes of the Red Cross movement is really integration of the community, because we have come to see that their role and being really having this grassroots approach to disaster management, whether it be a natural disaster or this public health emergency disasters, having the community at the center of this ensures this effectiveness of early warning systems, effectiveness of the response operations, and also enhances the resilience of this community as they are more involved in the processes of recovery, post-recovery, post-disaster recovery rather. So thank you very much, Dr. Ben. And as we get into the plenary discussion, it would be really interesting to hear from the participants about what you think about this kind of priorities in terms of collaborative engagements within the region in terms of different organizations, both at the national level and also at the regional level, aimed at public health and other disaster management efforts. Now, just want to hand over to my colleagues from the Africa CDC to hear from their perspective about what activities they're engaging in and what they see as their regional priorities for Africa. And I want to hand over the floor to Dr. Justin Maeda for his contributions. Over to you, Dr. Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stella. And I think I'll just go quickly because I think most of the things that also as a priority within the region have been covered by Dr. Ben, and Dr. Ben has really preempted most of things that I've also talked, but I'll still do some that we need to see so that we can see some areas of overlap and then see how do we move forward as we touch that. So as per this topic, one of the key areas that Africa CDC put as a priority is to make sure that we also do what we call the capacity building on public health law and policies within member states who are within these areas. And this is to make sure that those policies and public health laws focus and they put a population that need to be served at the center of focus in developing these policies and laws. This will make sure that we protect them against misuse of whatever actors or responders who may do that, especially in the time of need, but also making sure that the authorities also understand that it's their obligation to protect the population itself, and they need to be protected against, and especially when certain political or political agendas put this population into jeopardy, especially with such during the public health emergencies, where you see, but because of such, the authority was trying to protect things like data as well as the access to human actors to support those. And that has to be in a way that we advocate for them to be sure that these populations is their sole right to get an access to the best service possible through allowing the actors to access the data that is required to protect the population by providing evidence that will really sharpen the response strategies, as well as giving that corridor that allows those actors to really work, especially when the authorities cannot provide that protection or cannot provide that support to those populations that are vulnerable. So that's number one. Number two is all safeguarding the health security of those population as well. And this is key because I think most of especially the actors, we seems to be, and we are interpreted by the population as we go there when there's problems, and they need to see us there before the problems happen, and trying to see us working with them together to protect, to prevent from those events, for those events to happen, and also prepare them to respond, as well as put in some preparedness measures to respond if such happens. So during that peacetime, this is when they need to see us more engaging them in the prediction, prevention, protection, preparedness, etc., so that even when time of response comes, we have more collaboration, more support from them. And this is through two big issues that we're trying to focus on, especially for ensuring the health security. Number one is to make sure that we have a competent workforce that can be able to prevent and protect this society, as well as responding if public health events happens, but also institutional strengthening, that if we have any issues, including the national plans for public health, for health security, they need to be institutionalized. They don't need to be owned by temporary structures that can fall off easily. That's why we've been promoting for ensuring that each country have what we call the National Public Health Institute that owns these plans, own these priorities and implement them through a more stable structure that allows even transfer of knowledge and experience from previous events to the new events for improved efficiency in responding to such. But also the National Public Health Institute allows also multi-sectorial umbrella that covers all the sectors that has a stake on public health. And this is key so that we don't start running through requesting for multiple approval from multiple sectors, especially if that public health event covers multiple sectors. The third thing is issues of mutual accountabilities, especially on the state parties, and ensuring that each state parties that falls within the region, including the countries and member states, they have a mutual obligation of protecting each other from events. And this is mainly through ensuring that if you have an event in your place that put other member states or other state parties into danger, you communicate with them so that they know that there's imposed danger next to their borders or next to their door, and they need to be prepared. This is key, and it's something that we keep on advocating for, and we make sure that these countries all take that mutual accountability to do so. But also, even within countries themselves, within sectors, this is also very key to ensure that if you have an animal sector that has detected a certain danger that can cross over to human sector or to human health, they need to inform each other, and that mutual accountability for ensuring that we help each other to prevent and protect each other works. So within this, the priority that Africa CDC is putting in place is to make sure that we have those what they call the regional collaboration, coordination, and communication and cooperation frameworks and platform that allows different stakeholders, member states within the region to cooperate and coordinate and share information, exchange lessons, and also help each other in terms of needs. And through this, we have created what we call the regional collaborating centers, which Africa CDC models of working is not through regional offices. It's more of creating platform within each region that we allow all these stakeholders to come together and share what they're doing within the regions, etc. And also through that way, also it's create what we call also a network mechanism, either network of professions, network of public health assets, including the labs, so that if one lab has a certain capacity that the other labs within the region don't have, through that network, all other member states can access those labs using the network we use. And one of these networks is what we call the Regional Integrated Service and Laboratory Network, where we're trying to network all the public health assets and public health efforts within the region to come together and share such capacity. So within this, we really make sure that also through this platform, we harmonize different efforts, especially done by multiple sectors, so that they can align and they can really address the health security challenges and health security threats that exist within those regions. So those are the key priorities. We have many, but I just wanted to touch those that I feel they are so crucial and essential for this session. Over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Justin Maeda, for sharing that insights with us about the work that Africa CDC is doing and prioritizing within the region. I'm particularly encouraged to hear about the promotion of this institutionalization of these frameworks and having, strong, stable institutions within member states that would be managing public health emergencies. And this is, I think, one of the recommendations we do have in the report, and having this multi-sectoral approach to public health emergency disaster management, that we are approaching this with all sectors of government and not having a siloed approach or engagement within this risk management processes. So at this point, I just want to open up the floor to colleagues, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Elvis, to just kind of guide us through this discussion with the participants in the room about what do you think about the regional priorities in the for Africa. Over to you, Elvis.
Okay, thank you very much, Stella, for giving me the floor for this session. This session where we'll be talking about regional priorities. And I just want to make it clear that from a global perspective, region in this case means Africa, but from an African perspective, a region in this case may refer to what Dr. Justin just rightly mentioned about the regional collaborating centers within the African continent. So for the past few days, we've been discussing about public health emergencies, and most of the discussion has centered about what is not working, but I think there have been situations where people have mentioned things that already exist and that are working. So this session is an opportunity for us to unpack what is already being addressed in certain regions, as well as look at the areas where there is need for improvement. And when we identify this, what should be the top priorities of the governments in these regions and why we think these are priorities, and also look at the areas where we can do some more research and have more recommendations. So right now the floor is open for discussion, and we will be checking those who want to take the floor so that we can hand the microphone to them. Over. If you want to have the floor, please just do so by a show of hand. Okay, I see Madam Christy Tiwoda has a hand up. Please, over to you.
Ok, merci de me donner la parole. Merci de me donner l'opportunité de participer à cette importante réunion sur les cadres juridiques pour la préparation et la réponse aux urgences de santé publique. Pour suivre le plan de discussion que vous avez proposé, je pense que l'une des réalisations qui est importante en matière de préparation et de réponse aux urgences de santé publique dans nos pays, c'est peut-être le système l'implémentation du système de gestion des incidents. Je pense que c'est un système avec les centres des opérations d'urgence santé publique qui est implémenté dans plusieurs pays avec un certain succès. Je pense que c'est une vraie, comment dire ça, c'est vraiment quelque chose d'important qui est accompli dans les pays parce que ça permet de mettre en œuvre une méthodologie de préparation et de réponse coordonnée à une urgence de santé publique. Maintenant, pour ce qui concerne les points qui pourraient être améliorés, que je vais mixer avec ce que pourraient être les priorités. Moi, je vais revenir au sujet qui nous a rassemblés, à savoir les cadres juridiques. Et je vais revenir sur la question des ressources. Donc, nous sommes tous d'accord sur cette plateforme que pour répondre, pour se préparer et pour répondre de façon efficace, aussi bien aux catastrophes qu'aux événements et urgences de santé publique, nous avons besoin de cadres juridiques, de cadres institutionnels qui sont adaptés. Nous sommes également d'accord, et ça confirme des diagnostics qui ont déjà été faits, qu'il y a un besoin d'évaluation législative, il y a un besoin de réforme législative. Mais je pense que nous nous sommes peut-être moins posé la question sur avec quelles ressources est-ce que nous allons faire ces évaluations législatives qui sont nécessaires, qui ont déjà été prescrites par plusieurs documents, par plusieurs organisations, pour lesquelles plusieurs méthodologies ont même déjà été proposées. L'Organisation de la santé animale a une méthodologie, le CDC a une méthodologie, l'OMS a une méthodologie. Nous venons de discuter d'une autre potentielle méthodologie pour le faire. Quand je parle de ressources, je parle d'abord de ressources humaines. Je pense que nous devrons, et là je parle des points qui méritent d'être améliorés et j'embraye directement sur les priorités. Je pense que dans le développement le workforce development for preparedness and response to public health emergency qui est une priorité d'Africa CDC, devrait intégrer les ressources humaines formées sur les questions législatives. C'est-à-dire qu'il s'agit certes de travailleurs de la santé, de professionnels de la santé, mais il s'agit également de personnes, ça peut être des juristes, ça peut être des professionnels de santé qui sont formés sur le droit ou bien des professionnels de la gestion des risques ou bien des catastrophes, mais qui doivent être formés sur ces problématiques-là pour que les évaluations législatives qui sont nécessaires puissent être menées par des personnes compétentes qui comprennent bien l'environnement de gestion de risques ou bien de gestion des événements et des urgences de santé publique dont il s'agit. Je parle également de priorités en termes de ressources matérielles, de financement. Comme je l'ai déjà dit par ailleurs, on est d'accord sur la nécessité. Il y a des diagnostics qui ont été faits, mais il y a très peu de ressources qui sont affectées aux évaluations et aux réformes législatives dans les pays. Donc, je pense que aussi bien l'Union africaine, Africa CDC, que les autres partenaires qui sont ici, je pense qu'il est important qu'on donne la priorité à ces évaluations en mettant en jeu les ressources financières nécessaires pour le faire. Je pense que la Fédération internationale à Croix-Rouge qui nous a conviés à cette réunion est bien placée pour savoir que mener une évaluation législative et une réforme législative, ça coûte de la ressource humaine, ça coûte du temps et ça coûte de l'argent et que ça doit être priorisé. Je vous remercie.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Madame Chiwoda. So I think she mostly mentioned the fact that one of the areas where things are already being well done are the emergency operation centers, where in certain areas they are working quite well. And the areas that need to be reviewed are mostly around the laws around emergencies, which need to be evaluated. And currently there are so many different methodologies. And for these methodologies to be properly put in place, we need human resource. And also this human resource does not only require public health experts or legal experts, but public health experts with some training in legal issues or legal experts with some training in public health so that this process can be well understood. And I think she also laid a lot of emphasis on the need for resources, among which workforce and material and financial resources. So just to make a resume on what she said, I think that that could be what I may suggest. So now, any other person who wants to make a contribution to this discussion?
My hand is raised.
Oh, yes, over to you, Dr. Muita.
Thank you. I thank the team, the IFRC team, and the colleagues who have contributed to the last 2 days. For this particular session, I'd like to request the public health law practitioners to explore or to research. This is in response to question, I think the fourth question. What other topics would it be helpful to have a research and recommendations for? If they could initiate or start real-time policy surveillance to see how policies and laws are being applied in response to pandemics, or even during peacetime, quote unquote. Why I say this is because this exercise, which they have done an excellent job, it was really a snapshot of it's a research of, okay, you went back to look at what was happening, but it may not reflect everything that is ongoing. So if you had a policy surveillance angle to the application of the laws, I think it would be very helpful. Just like in health, we have surveillance. We do surveillance for diseases. We keep surveying to see what's going on. That's a suggestion. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Muita. I'm happy that this point has come up again because in one of the breakout room discussions, somebody brought up this issue of absence of real-time surveillance as concerns public health emergency law. So this comes to add more flesh to this suggestion. Thank you very much. Yeah, so the floor is still open. I see we've got some people in the house, like Dr. Okunromade from Nigeria. Do you have any experience to share with us as concerns what is going on in Nigeria?
And Professor Saj has his hand up as well.
Oh, yes, I was also looking for Professor Serge Emalu. Yes, Professor, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you. I will talk about what is done and what is needed to be done in terms of law could be improved in our region, in Central Africa region. So during this pandemic, we found out that there was a lot of gaps between the communication gaps between countries. So something needs to be done to improve the way countries get prepared and the way they share the information they have at their level to better make, the cross-border, to better, let's say, regulate the cross-border public health information shared. And that's I think we found out that was a big gap during within the region. So the country don't speak to each other. They work in siloed, which is not very good in terms of emergency preparedness. And that's one thing which could be, I don't know how we could work to manage to improve that. And the other thing is that one of the gap again was the fact that there were no harmonization within the region, the same region, in terms of some standard of care or standard of even. I also mentioned that the standard in terms of lab testing, in terms of patient care, or in terms of all these kind of things could be or harmonized to make sure that when a patient moves from one area to another, he can benefit to the same level of care or the same level of assessment, even in the lab requirement within the same region. So that was one of one of the point we found out, like the weaknesses in terms of collaboration within countries in our region here. And of course, there was a lack also of, let's say, at the regional level, a preparedness and response plan. Each country has its own emergency response plan, but there was no harmonization within the region who could enable country to, let's say, move one teams to another to help, or even having to deploy emergency response team, the cross-border emergency response teams. So those are some issue we found in the Central African region who need to be addressed to better prepare for the future epidemic or pandemic to come. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Emale. I think you mentioned the difficulty in exchange of data, and we all know that data is the cornerstone for evidence-based interventions. And just for information, that is something that we are well aware here at the headquarters, and we are currently working on a continental project which has to do with health information exchange, such that there will be possibilities of countries sharing data among themselves in the regions, and also with the central level, and also such that the different platforms that countries are using to collect this data can talk to each other, so for easy exploitation of the data. I think the next thing you mentioned was standardization of tests, for example. And I think Dr. Justin, in his intervention, mentioned this regional network of laboratories, such that not only would there be possibility of exploiting available capacity for the region, but some sort of harmonization of the approach as well as the way analysis is being done. I think the last thing you mentioned was the availability of a response team. So I would use the expression that Dr. John, our director, uses, where he talks about having a SWAT team. So part of the objectives of Africa's, the functional pillars of Africa's CDC is building capacity and then identifying and mapping capacity within countries and within regions, such that if there is something like an outbreak in a country or in a region, there could be local deployment of a team to contain and manage this outbreak before it spreads all over again. I can see that Dr. Muita has his hand up. I don't know whether it's an old hand and I'm also seeing Professor Emale's hand. We are running out of time. We've got 2 more minutes. Dr. Martin, do you have something to add?
Thank you. I think you have said what I wanted to say, but let me mention to colleagues, if you can look at the document from the independent panel, the document called Make It the Last Pandemic, Make It the Last Pandemic. The recommendation number 4, it's about international surveillance and the validation of alerts. If the public health law practitioners, if they could start looking at this even before the international community craft regulations on international surveillance, and that ties, Elvis, to what you have been talking about, that you are developing platform where member states can be reporting. But there's a need for law and policies. And I believe colleagues on this forum can really take that one up. We don't need to wait for the rest of the international community as a continent to start addressing this issue. It's a huge challenge, and you acknowledge that. Thank you very much, Elvis. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Muita, for that comment. I see Osman has a hand up. Yes, Osman, you've got 1.5 minutes, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you, Elvis. And I think the international health regulation has key role to play here when we are talking about issues of, having something that will bind regional, yes, most especially, like, for instance, like in Sierra Leone with Guinea, when COVID-19 started, borders were closed while the one with Guinea was opened. And by the time when ours was open, Guinea decided to close there. So there were a little bit of disagreement, in the area of responding. And again, there are also like issues of like this information sharing. Understand that there are various treatment centers around the country where patients leave one place to another. So that's information sharing, that connection is very much key. And even with developing case definition as well for this, where you will find out that a particular province is handling this while the other areas are also handling it. So there was a delay in developing this case definition for health workers. So this was a very big challenge, I want to say, because others cannot, we are not able to like notice who is a COVID-19 patient or who is not a COVID-19 patient. So there was a delay in developing this case definition. So information sharing, to me, is very much key when we want to address issues of this nature.
Okay, thank you very much, Osman. I think from the break room discussions and also from the exchanges, if there is one key word that I retain personally, is the need for communication. And this communication can be at a continental level, regional level, national level, and even in the national level, there's supposed to be some, there should be a very well-established way of communication, of information exchange, if at all there is need for harmonization and coordination of any of a response to any public health emergency. So on this comment, I would like to hand over the floor back to Stella. And thank you very much for your participation in this session. Thank you very much for being part of this very interesting two-day consultation. Over to you, Stella.
Thank you so much, Elvis, and thank you so much, colleagues, for sharing your insights about what we can do, what we need to be prioritizing as a region. And I was really just quite interested. I wish we had more time to discuss this. Really quite interested by the points that were raised at this last juncture by Dr. Muita and also by Professor Serge from ICAS about having legislation or having regional laws that are cohesive and that we're speaking the same language, that what is happening in one country is happening in the next country. And I think that's one of the tenets that we have of the African Union, is promoting union and promoting unity within the African continent and trying to understand how can we better be prepared as Africa, and we're not waiting for the rest of the world, but how can we be better prepared as a continent to better deal with these issues or the challenges that we face when it comes to a disaster management or management of disasters of a public health nature. And I'm curious, and I know we don't have time to discuss this, but I'm really just curious to know what your insights would be when it comes to having this regional laws, having a convention, having a sub-regional convention within Eastern Africa, within Southern Africa, within Central Africa, within West Africa, having this kind of cohesion, having cohesive regional priorities and regional engagements between the different sub-regions within the continent. How are we connecting West Africa and Central Africa, considering we do have public health emergencies that are cross-border between these two regions? How are we connecting Southern Africa to Eastern Africa? How are we connecting together as a whole? And how can we make sure that we are having a cohesive approach to management, that what one country is doing is applicable across the board? I know Africa is a melting pot of a lot of different variables, but we are capable of this sort of unified approach to this engagement because the stakeholders have one core theme and core ideology at the heart of all their engagements, and that's putting the community at the center of that. So really very interested to hear about that. And just thinking about this development of legislations, and I'm going back to the point that Christy did mention about capacity building, and recognizing that it's not an approach that can be for one group of people, that when we're talking about legislative reform and understanding that this is something that is crucial, it is not going to be the responsibility of the lawyers or the public health emergency lawyers. It's not going to be just the responsibility of public health emergency experts. We're going to need to have a diverse group of stakeholders being involved in these processes, but there's a need to build their capacity, that resourcing of the capacity to be able to engage in this kind of processes and understand what are the key considerations we need to take or have in mind when we're developing different legislations that speak about disaster risk management holistically or just public health emergencies. So with that, I just want to briefly, in our very last session, I know we're just running out of time, but in our very last session, my colleague Janik is going to share with you some of the tools that the IFRC disaster law has developed that can really support these processes, both at a regional level and also at a national level, because a lot of the times we find that these processes, when they're driven from a national perspective, it is very easy to adapt them and engage them at a regional or a sub-regional level. So I'm going to hand over the floor to you, Janik, for a very short presentation before we close this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stella. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I do realize that we have run out of time, but I very briefly just wanted to go through the disaster law tools that are available to support legislative review processes. Because in these consultation sessions, we really did a deep dive into the findings and recommendations of the PHE report and the guidance in the PHE pilot guidance on how laws and policies can be strengthened to improve legal preparedness for future public health emergencies. And it's hoped that, through the use of these tools, we can try to ensure that this is the last global pandemic that we face. So just following on to the rich plenary discussion that we had, and actually the very rich discussions that we've been having throughout these 2 days of consultations, I'm just going to really briefly go through the tools available to support legislative review processes. So IFRC disaster law, as Stella mentioned in the first opening session, we are really experienced in providing technical assistance to governments which are updating their laws, policies, and plans relating to disasters. And in providing this technical assistance, we work very closely with our national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, allowing us to really leverage their experience as first responders to disasters and emergencies in the country. And we work, throughout the region. I have included here an example of a project that we are running in Malawi, where we have been supporting the Malawi Red Cross in their role in supporting the government authorities in the revision of the DRM law in the country. And currently, the DRM bill is awaiting parliamentary approval. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go through the project in a bit more detail. I was hoping to go through it in a bit more detail, but really what I wanted to share on this slide is just that we do work really closely with our national societies in the revision of DRM laws and policies, and we provide technical support in this regard, and that we are available to provide technical support in this regard. And I've set out the contact details of the Africa team, and you're more than welcome to reach out to us for further information. So in providing our technical guidance, we rely on a suite of guidance documents which are designed to support the review of domestic laws and policies. So our main guidance documents are really the Disaster Preparedness and Response Checklist, which focuses on domestic disaster preparedness and response, the Law and Disaster Risk Reduction Checklist, which focuses on domestic disaster risk reduction, and the IDRL guidelines, which has also been formulated as a checklist. And these two documents focus on the role of law in facilitating international disaster assistance. And once it's finalized, the PHE guidance, which we've been consulting on over these last 2 days, is going to join the suite of guidance documents. And all of these documents take quite a similar form in the sense that they each consist of key questions that lawmakers and officials and those who support the law development process can use to guide the legislative review process and identify gaps and weaknesses within their existing laws, which can be addressed through legislative review processes. So for each question contained in each of our tools, we recommend a 3-step analysis is taken, looking at whether the relevant laws that exist address the particular issue adequately. If not, whether this is adequately addressed within a non-binding legal document, and this might make it that legal provisions aren't actually necessary. And then thirdly, are the relevant provisions actually implemented in practice? And this 3-stage analysis permits reviewers to identify the strengths and gaps in the existing legal and policy framework, whether a greater focus is needed on dissemination or implementation of the existing laws, rather than necessarily drafting new laws, and whether actually updated or revised laws, policies, or plans are required. So just to finish off, based on our experience, we have identified a few key ingredients for a successful legislative review process. And the first is really that effective planning is critical from the outset, because it's really important to set out a clear set of steps and the timeline for those steps to allow for anticipation and preempting any potential setbacks which might be faced. And secondly, strong and sustained commitment and political will from the government is needed, as well as from relevant government agencies, because this is really important to ensure that the review process is completed and that the new laws are passed by Parliament. Thirdly, broad consultation with all relevant stakeholders and other actors is required to ensure that the new or updated arrangements are comprehensive, that they take operational realities into account, and that they give the voice to communities and vulnerable groups. Then fourthly, that these legislative review processes are conducted through legal mappings and analysis using the tools developed in this regard, and also that they're not limited to not only the PHE laws or only the DRM laws, but they take into account all relevant sectoral laws because the issues are so cross-cutting. And finally, monitoring the implementation of new and updated laws, policies, and plans is vital because so once new or updated instruments are enacted, a monitoring and evaluation framework should be developed to keep track of whether the legal requirements are actually implemented. So I just wanted to finish off with those final thoughts on the legislative review process and the work that IFRC disaster law does. So we really hope that following this global pandemic, more and more governments use the lessons learned from this pandemic to strengthen their their PHE frameworks to ensure that another global pandemic doesn't occur in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Janique, for that brief overview. Just to let you know about the tools that the IFRC disaster law has developed, we're available to support national governments and even regional organizations should they need to develop or get engaged in this legislative review processes, and really understanding that one of the things that really supports how a response is effective is being prepared at the outset. So with that being said, I see we're 6 minutes over our allotted time with you. I want to say a big thank you to you all. And I want to hand over to my colleague who has been my partner in developing this and organizing this particular two-day session from the Africa CDC, Dr. Elvis, to just give us some closing remarks before we conclude. Over to you, Dr. Elvis.
Okay, thank you very much, Stella, for handing back the floor to me. I would like to seize this opportunity to thank IFRC for this partnership. As it was mentioned in the opening of this session, that since the signing of an MOU of collaboration between Africa CDC and International Federation of the Red Cross, this is one of our major activities that we have carried out together, and we believe that with our common objectives, we have so much arena on which we can do so much collaboration. I would also want to extend special thanks to all the representatives of the member states, as well as the representatives of the different organizations and institutions in the member states for this continuous support, especially at this point in time where we are working on creating the new public health order for Africa, as if I may quote our director. And this public health order needs that all the different stakeholders come on board at the level of inception, conception, implementation, and evaluation of all the public health interventions that we put in place, or that we plan to put in place, especially at this point in time where, in the face of any epidemic or any pandemic, there is need for self-reliance. So we believe that this continuous and renewed collaboration and partnership between Africa CDC and the different member states of the Africa Union is going to permit us to build a public health system that would make us strong enough to face any adversity. And just to mention that on this endeavor, we cannot work alone. That is why we need strong, reliable, and respectful partnership as the one you've seen today. I wouldn't take much of your time. I just want to say I was humbled and much elated by all the different discussions and exchanges. And we look forward to follow-up meetings on the resolutions that were taken from this meeting, as well as the implementation and evaluation of all what has been done. Thank you very much. Over to you, Stella.
Thank you so much, Elvis. Thank you, colleagues, for taking the time to be with us today. I can see we're 9 minutes over time, but I want to say my sincere thank you to my colleagues at Africa's ADC for the support in the organization and the development and conceptualization of this event. We've been able to achieve quite a bit with your support, and we do look forward to having continuous engagements on different processes. As we saw from the interventions that were shared by Dr. Justin Maeda and as well as Dr. Bernardinoy, that there are a lot of points of convergence between our organizations, and these are some of the key considerations that we need to have as we move forward. And I'm encouraged also by the network that we've been able to pull into the room, just to understand that there is a need to engage with sub-regional organizations, with member states, with other international organizations working within the region, and as well as with our national societies and communities, and putting them at the center of it all, because we do this work so that they're able to be more resilient and be able to be able to be more resilient when it comes to disaster recovery. So with that being said, I see we're 10 minutes over the time. I want to say a sincere thank you to you all. We do look forward to engaging with you further on this issue. Once the pilot guidance has been finalized and consulted in the other regions, we will be able to share with you a final document for your to support your activities within the region and within the country. And I also want to encourage those of you who will still have any further comments to the pilot guidance, please see the chat box below that there is a link that you can fill in an online survey. The pilot guidance presently is available in English, French, and Arabic. You can take some time to review it within this next 3 weeks and be able to provide your additional inputs or feedback to the pilot guidance. Thank you very much for your contributions and for your very active engagement on this particular topic. And we look forward to seeing you in the next engagement, hopefully soon. Thank you very much. Have a good evening to you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Au revoir à tous. Merci pour l'équipe groupe français.